Speaking as someone who's been deeply involved in America's gun culture for decades, I can tell you this: the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives is rapidly losing its grip on suppressor control faster than anyone thought possible. What used to be seen as lockdown by the National Firearms Act is now starting to show serious cracks. Are we watching the beginning of the end for suppressor and short-barreled firearm regulations under the N.F.A? In today's breakdown, we'll explore how a massive budget package may have just handed gun owners the biggest legislative victory in decades. We'll dig into the bill's specifics, the route that could completely remove suppressors from N.F.A, regulation, and what that means for Form 4 processing, tax stamps, agency workload, and the shifting legal foundation underneath it all. We'll also take a look at where the Short Act stands, how it ties into an obscure Senate rule known as the Byrd Rule, and why this moment could reshape the entire civilian firearms landscape, from titanium supplier contracts and legislative tactics to long overdue legal progress and the unintended legacy of the year 1934. There's a whole lot happening that goes way beyond what the average citizen sees. And if the Senate moves quickly, your next suppressor might just be something you buy over the counter. No wait, no paperwork, no fingerprints. These days, you won't hear much about the National Firearms Act at your average gun shop or range day, but it still underpins nearly every regulation we deal with. It was born out of the violent chaos of the Great Depression, when gangsters like Dillinger turned Thompson submachine guns and sawed-off scatterguns into urban legends. Back then, even the National Rifle Association, which today fiercely opposes most forms of gun control, was working alongside lawmakers to craft regulations targeting what they called gangster guns. That's how suppressors, short-barreled rifles, and short-barreled shotguns all wound up under the same roof, slapped with a transfer tax of $200 a fee that, in 1934 dollars, was clearly meant to price average Americans out of ownership. As the decades passed and inflation took its toll, that $200 fee turned from a financial roadblock into more of a bureaucratic speed bump. But the process itself never got any easier. Fingerprints, mugshots, background checks, multiple forms, and a painfully slow approval timeline, all just for a little hearing protection or recoil reduction. For about 40 years after the law took effect, the NRA still played ball with D.C. They even helped pass the Federal Firearms Act in the year 1938 and stood behind some of the changes that came after major assassinations in the 60s. But that cooperation ended cold after 1971, when an ATF raid left an NRA member dead. The grassroots base erupted in protest, and after the 1977 Cincinnati revolt, hardliners took over and vowed never again to support gun control. What no one predicted back then was that nearly 5 decades later, it wouldn't be protests or lawsuits that took the N.F.A apart, but federal budget arithmetic. Fast forward to this month, the House barely passed House Resolution Number 1, nicknamed the One Big Beautiful Bill, by a single vote margin, 215 in favor, 214 opposed. Buried in the nearly 400-page bill is Section 2 of the Hearing Protection Act, which removes suppressors from the National Firearms Act altogether. That means no more tax, no registration, no background check, and no fingerprinting. Backers are calling it a long overdue fix for hunters and sports shooters who risk long-term hearing damage every time they fire a 12-gauge before sunrise. Critics argue that cutting 20 to 35 decibels makes it harder for law enforcement to pinpoint gunshots during an active shooter event. But let's set the record straight: suppressors do not make guns silent. Even a suppressed rifle cracks louder than a jackhammer. Still, public perception plays a huge role, and that's exactly why pro-gun voices are cheering this unexpected legislative tactic known as budget reconciliation. Reconciliation is a rare procedure that allows spending bills to bypass the usual Senate filibuster and pass with a simple majority. That's allowed because the bill's primary focus is tax and expenditure policy. This all traces back to the Congressional Budget Act of the year 1974 and the Byrd Rule, named after Senator Robert Byrd, which blocks unrelated items unless they impact government revenue. That's the key. Since suppressor regulation is tied to a $200 transfer tax collected by the Treasury, erasing that line item effectively erases the regulation. No argument over the Second Amendment, just a simple tax code adjustment. When opponents tried to challenge this in the Rules Committee, the Senate parliamentarian reportedly shot it down. A tax repeal changes the budget, that's all that matters. And the statistics speak volumes. Americans have now legally registered nearly 5 million suppressors. In just the first half of last year, another 1.4 million were added. According to ATF records obtained via the Freedom of Information Act, the system is buried. Paper-based Form 4s were taking close to a year. Even electronic filings ballooned from 90 days to 180, then up to 270 days despite automation. Gun shops are losing business. Customers are walking away, and ATF examiners are buried under stacks of Form 4473s and outdated N.F.A. files. If suppressors get cut from N.F.A. classification, millions of paperwork entries would disappear overnight, letting the agency redirect resources toward genuine criminal threats rather than micromanaging duck hunters and weekend shooters. Even the Congressional Budget Office conceded that the Hearing Protection Act would drop federal tax revenue by around $1.4 billion over the next 10 years, a rounding error in a federal budget that crosses $6 trillion. Gun rights advocates say it's a fair trade. Less bureaucracy, fewer delays, and more time spent addressing real crime. Short-barreled firearms are now entering the same conversation. The Stop Harassing Owners of Rifles Today Act, better known as the Short Act, has been introduced in both chambers of Congress. Its goal is to wipe barrel length restrictions from the National Firearms Act entirely. The lawmakers behind it are responding directly to the stabilizing brace fiasco of last year, when the previous administration moved to reclassify roughly 40 million brace-equipped carbines as unregistered short-barreled rifles. It triggered an avalanche of lawsuits that paralyzed enforcement efforts. Suddenly, average gun owners found out that the plastic brace they bought legally could be used to charge them with a felony. Erasing barrel-length rules would shut that door for good and make all those lawsuits irrelevant. That said, the Short Act's path is tougher than the suppressor repeal. The key difference is revenue. While suppressors are clearly tied to a tax stream, short-barreled guns also sit within broader definitions of restricted weapons. Senate staffers are scrambling to word the bill in a way that ties it narrowly to excise taxes, which might let it sneak through under the Byrd rule. Gun rights organizations, everything from Gun Owners of America to state-level chapters, have been flooding Capitol Hill with calls, urging lawmakers to pass both measures through reconciliation. Inside the ATF, reactions are mixed. Field agents tasked with tracking straw buyers see little value in maintaining a registry of serialized metal tubes, especially when nearly one-third of Form 4 applications show duplicate or incorrect serial numbers. Supervisors admit that the electronic system update from last winter almost collapsed their servers. There's no question the N.F.A. division would shrink if suppressors get removed, since funding follows workload. But veteran officials know that when one responsibility is cut, another usually takes its place. Killing suppressor oversight might just mean staff gets reassigned to investigate forced reset triggers or to expand firearm tracing databases. The bigger worry is the precedent. If suppressors can be deregulated with a budget vote, what's to stop Congress from undoing restrictions on auto parts next? One insider even joked that a Browning M2 could be one budget cycle away from being labeled a hearing-safe accessory. From a legal perspective, pulling suppressors out from under National Firearms Act control kicks off a domino effect of policy shifts. First and foremost, that $200 tax stamp? Gone. Next, suppressors would be reclassified as standard Title I firearms under the Gun Control Act. That means buyers would just complete a Form 4473, pass a background check, and walk out with the can that same day. No fingerprinting, no federal registry wait, none of the bureaucratic baggage. State-level restrictions still apply, of course. Places like New Jersey or Illinois would keep their bans unless state lawmakers decide otherwise. But on the federal level, all the old hurdles vanish. Even transport rules would get a facelift. Instead of stashing your suppressor in a locked case with a stamped Form 4 taped to the lid, you could just drop it in your range bag like a bipod or spotting scope, assuming your destination state is cool with it. Another big shift, the relevance of N.F.A. trusts and legal entities would drop off fast. The whole purpose behind creating a trust letting others use your suppressor without fingerprinting would evaporate. That simplifies inheritance too. Rather than navigating a maze of legal documents to pass it down, your can could be handed off like a scoped bolt gun or a box of reloading dies. Now, let's talk about those mountains of paperwork. The ATF's N.F.A. branch still holds on to decades of records, some in outdated digital formats, some on ancient microfilm tracing all the way back to the World War II era. There's no shortage of gun owners who'd love to see those records go up in smoke, but it's not as easy as tossing them in a bonfire. According to the National Archives, tax-related forms like these are considered temporary and are slated for disposal. Still, archivists often argue for keeping historical documents around. One compromise already under consideration would be to seal old Form 4s, the same way they handled abandoned Form 1s tied to machine gun blueprints hidden from public access but not fully erased. If the legislation becomes law, administrative rulemaking will iron out those finer points. With all the red tape involved, we might not see those changes go into effect until sometime in fiscal year 2027. On the economic side, the civilian market would feel the impact right away. As it stands, most suppressors retail for about $600 before taxes. Once you tack on the $200 tax stamp and maybe $50 for fingerprinting and passport photos, the whole process becomes a hassle. But if the tax and wait times are scrapped, buyers could walk out with just the sticker price after a quick 10-minute National Instant Criminal Background Check System review. Suppressor manufacturers are already projecting a sales jump of at least 20% in the first year, just like what happened in New Zealand before their confiscation crackdown in 2019. Meanwhile, insurers are predicting fewer hearing-related claims, as more shooters embrace better ear protection. Audiologists point out that unsuppressed rifle fire, which often reaches up to 160 decibels, can cause permanent damage in a single shot. That said, some law enforcement trainers are sounding alarms about forensics. Sure, suppressed rounds still break the pain threshold, but the altered muzzle signature can complicate ballistic tracing in close-quarters urban environments. The FBI's Ballistic Research Facility has already ordered new sound analysis tools to stay ahead of the curve. Politically speaking, this budget reconciliation strategy gives Republicans a headline-grabbing win heading into the next election season. They can say they eliminated a Prohibition-era tax under the banner of protecting civil liberties, while also extending tax cuts and pumping more resources into border enforcement. Democrats, on the other hand, are walking a tightrope. If they try to yank the suppressor language from the bill, they risk looking like they're blocking a tax break for everyday Americans. But if they leave it in, they face backlash from donors pushing for tighter gun laws. A few centrists have tossed out a half-measured drop the tax to zero, but keep the registry in place. Gun rights advocates have mocked that idea, calling it N.F.A. light, a bureaucratic speed bump without any of the supposed safety benefits. Over in the Senate, the numbers game is simple: 51 votes, a 10-hour cap on floor debate, and the green light from the parliamentarian. Republicans technically control 51 seats, maybe 53, if you count a couple of independent swing votes. If every part of the bill passes the Byrd Rule smell test, they won't need a single Democrat to cross over, which is rare these days. If the suppressor section survives the last round of amendments, insiders expect it to hit the president's desk right around early July, just in time for Independence Day headlines, celebrating a new chapter of sound moderated liberty. When it comes to the Short Act, insiders say it's most likely to appear as a floor amendment during Senate proceedings. If it makes it past the Byrd Rule test, it'll get a straight up or down vote. If not, its supporters are already working on fallback options, possibly sliding it into the final package as a temporary pilot program, or phasing out barrel length restrictions over 5 years. For the average gun owner, the smartest move right now might be to sit tight. Filing a new Form 4 today could mean handing over $200 for a tax that might be gone in a matter of months. Firearm retailers are already seeing hesitation among buyers, many of whom are holding off in hopes of being able to walk out with a suppressor the same way they do with a hunting rifle: no stamps, no delays. At the same time, secondhand suppressor prices are beginning to dip, so if you're someone who prefers certainty over perfect timing, there may be bargains to scoop up. Those who already have e-form applications in the pipeline are wondering whether the ATF will offer refunds if the law changes midstream. The answer: History says don't count on it. Back in 1992, when the government granted a limited amnesty for certain machine guns, the fees weren't returned, they simply approved the applications and redirected the money into Treasury accounts. Expect a similar playbook this time around. Meanwhile, Second Amendment advocacy groups are running full throttle. The day after the House passed the bill, Capitol Hill switchboards lit up. One staffer mentioned that suppressor-related calls even outnumbered the usual deluge of complaints about foreign spending. Grassroots activists are framing the debate as a constitutional fairness issue, comparing the suppressor tax to discredited policies, like poll taxes and taxes on religious materials. Volunteers are being trained to keep their calls brief and respectful, because congressional offices log where constituents stand, not how long they talk. On the other side, anti-gun political groups are sending out frantic emails warning about stealth weapons lurking in city neighborhoods. Both camps are fired up, and that just proves how controversial the National Firearms Act still is, even 90 years after it was signed into law. As for the mainstream press, it's more of the usual. Many outlets are trotting out attention-grabbing headlines like silencer bill, even though the proper legal term remains firearm muffler or silencer. Some journalists have taken a more measured tone, highlighting workplace safety standards, decibel exposure limits, and long-term hearing loss prevention. Others lean into hospital trauma stories, citing emergency doctors who say suppressed gunfire echoes unpredictably in enclosed areas. But subtlety rarely survives the clickbait cycle. The truth is, even a suppressed AR-15 still registers more than 50 decibels louder than a jackhammer. Then again, outrage generates more views and social media platforms know it. Behind the scenes, suppressor companies are preparing for a tidal wave of new business. One major facility in West Virginia has already gone to a 3-shift schedule, anticipating a surge of up to 700,000 additional units if the law changes. Domestic titanium suppliers are seeing dollar signs, with Chinese alloys still under stiff tariffs. American mills in the Appalachian region are poised to benefit in a big way. Wall Street has noticed shares of publicly traded suppressor manufacturers jump by 10% right after the House vote. Interestingly, the insurance sector barely flinched, suggesting that the financial world views this more as a growth opportunity for sporting goods than as a public risk. Civil rights lawyers are also watching this closely. If Congress willingly steps back from suppressor regulation, it could open the door for legal challenges to other parts of the National Firearms Act, particularly the post-1986 freeze on new machine guns under the Hughes Amendment. Plaintiffs may argue that allowing older, fully automatic firearms to sell for astronomical prices while banning new ones creates an unequal playing field, essentially reserving them for the wealthy elite while freezing out average enthusiasts. So far, the courts have steered clear of that battle. But if suppressor deregulation proceeds through reconciliation, it could weaken the government's long-standing argument that these rules are about generating revenue. In the end, everything hinges on 2 senators who haven't yet shown their hand, each one weighing whether it's worth backing the bill on principle or following strict parliamentary protocol. If even one of them backs out, the suppressor language is dead, and the House will be forced to swallow that defeat. But if both hold the line and President Trump follows through with his signature, we could be looking at same-day suppressor sales as early as this summer. Some gun shops are already planning midnight launch events just in case. And if the short act gets tacked on, we could finally see legal clarity on pistol braces, AR-based handguns, and lever-action rifles with chopped barrels like the mare's leg. If not, that fight will likely be pushed off until the next round of elections. That wraps it up for this update. So what's your take? Should the suppressor tax be eliminated once and for all? Is the short act the next big win for gun owners? Drop your thoughts in the comments. If you want to stay sharp on where this battle is headed, be sure to like the video, share it with your crew, hit that subscribe button, and tap the bell icon so you don't miss what comes next. This fight is far from over and is just starting to heat up.